finish off the final polish. Very little on this time, I hope. Right. Buffed up now. There we are. Right, it's not perfect, but then it probably was only perfect when it came off the production line. And I think I've given it a new lease of life. I've got to put the mechanism back in again. Oh look, it's going to strike after all. Just needed a bit of encouragement. So the strike spring is good, and I know that the time spring is good because it's been going now for 8 days. So my analysis when I took them out, that they're over 2.5 times the diameter of the drum, the barrel, was okay, and they were good, and that saves me putting in new springs. So there we are, and this little one is going to go back into its home very shortly. Well, I'm happy to say that I've got to the point where I am pleased with what I've been able to achieve. Those of you who have been following the earlier videos will remember that when it started, the clock had stains all over here on the skirting here, or the plinth. This was pretty dull. These weren't present. This was off. That wasn't on. And the filth and dirt in these at the bases of the columns were really very upsetting. You also recall that if you followed it, there were various faults with the movements themselves, which I think I have remedied. It's been on test now for 10 days. It's keeping reasonable time, and I think you want to bear in mind that a clock like this is not there to keep accurate time. You've got your iPhone for that. The clock is to be able to remind you, first historically, of what they used to be able to achieve in craftsmanship, and secondly, to give you an indication. The thing about this clock, it's not French, and as a consequence it doesn't have on it the little marker, little key here, which will alter the spring height, which will then make the clock go faster or slower. The only way that you can do that is the traditional way of altering the length of the pendulum rod. We'll come to that in a moment. The motifs have all brightened up, look pretty good. We've lost the high polish that we had here and on various parts of the clock, but that is a price that you have to pay if you want to get it to look working properly. It has been on test, as I said, for a number of days, about 10 or so. There are various problems here. The first is that this gong was, I don't think the original one, or something was wrong, because when it was fitted, and when I fitted it, it fouled the foot of the pendulum rod. So it had to be just altered a little in its verticality, and I made it so that it's clear of the base of the foot of the pendulum rod and not touching the side. The other problem is that when you deal with a clock like this and you have to alter and regulate the pendulum, it's very difficult to be able to lengthen or shorten the pendulum swing by lifting or dropping the pendulum bob and then putting the pendulum back on to the hook at the top. It is very difficult. You have to tip the clock over to be able to see how it's going. You need a pair of pliers, something like this, which will give you some sort of hold on the rod. But what I find is that with a clock like this, you simply best to accept the fact that it's going to gain or lose a regular amount each week. And if you're happy with that, then that's the function of this clock. I mean, it's probably over 100 years old. It's American. I think it's a very fine example of American craftsmanship in that transition period when it's trying to establish itself. America is establishing itself as craftsmen when they are having to fight the establishment of the French clocks. Just to go a little further on this, so we've got the hammer here. The hammer is very difficult to adjust. You have to either bend it or one way or another just to line up with this if it falls out of line. And if you do that, then these are the things that you want to use, which are parallel brass-faced pliers, which you can grip the rod with, and at the same time, by holding the rod further along, all you do is to alter this section of the rod without putting any strain on the other section, which is up on this point here, where you have got a problem. If you dislodge it, you will then have to solder the rod onto the boss that holds it onto the striking mechanism. And you've got to be careful that when you alter it, that the screw doesn't foul the hammer here, which it will do if you're not careful. That takes me on to another point. The beauty of this clock is that you have to get it so that it's going to be the beat's going to be in sync. Now, what I use is an industrial stethoscope, which is this, and with that you could hear, by putting it onto any metal part, this or the clocks itself, or even sometimes the case if it's a wooden one, and you can hear the beat. And if it's out of beat, then you can correct that in some clocks merely by lifting one side or the other until it's right. It'll be right when the pendulum rod is perpendicular and it is pointing to the center of the Earth's center of gravity. If that's not perpendicular and true to the Earth's center of gravity, then the beat won't be right. But with a French clock, you have got the beauty that you can actually hold the front here, like that, and rotate it just a millimeter or two. And that will then alter the perpendicularity of the rod, and that will mean you can get it in beat. You might have to just slack these off a tiny bit, and as I said, be careful when you tighten them up that they don't foul the hammer, where in this case it would do. As you can see that I haven't got them in true horizontal position, because if I do, this one fouls the hammer boss here. I have gilded the door at the back, not very successfully, but it looks brighter and better. I put a new lining on it, and that is nicer. But don't forget, this is the back of the clock, and generally speaking, it's not looks like a very nice American clock, early 20th century or late 19th century, and one which I think the Americans should be proud of, since their industries were, particularly their craftsmen's industries, were in a sort of a fledgling embryonic state compared with France, who had already been making these clocks for 200 years. So I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity of resurrecting this clock so that it can be used, and I think it will be used and can be run for another, well, if it's looked after, another 100 years. So with that, I bid you adieu, and I hope you've gleaned a little bit of information as to what you can do on a do-it-yourself basis in restoring some of these old magnificent clocks. Quite satisfactory. There's a floor there where it was chipped, but the dirt is completely off in here, and these are nicely even and black. The finials on top, the little motif here is gilded. These are too. They look much more alive. You can see that the front pillow, which was brass, glows a bit more than the other ones, which aren't brass. This is a brass one too, but that's iron, and so is that. I've been able to get the top and this back on place. The clock will, I hope, strike at the half hour, and then on the hour.